A woman contacted me 6 weeks ago about her late husband's security camera footage. Not because it showed a crime, not because it showed a break-in, but because it showed something that didn't make sense. Her husband had been recording their front porch for 3 years. Every night, without missing a single one. Thousands of hours, all time-stamped, all cataloged, all cross-referenced in handwritten notebooks. She said he kept telling her something was wrong with the timing. At first, I didn't think much of it. People fixate on things when they're anxious. Security cameras become comfort objects. Something predictable in a world that isn't. I assumed that's what this was. Then she told me how he died, and that's when I agreed to look. My name is Rafe Quinn. I investigate things that don't fit cleanly into reports. Not crimes, not always something dangerous. Just patterns. Patterns that repeat when they shouldn't. Patterns that resist explanation. Patterns that tend to disappear once people stop paying attention to them. I don't work for the police anymore. I work alone. I document what I find. Not because I expect answers, but because unanswered things have a habit of returning. The woman's name was Claire Hastings. Her husband was David. They lived in a quiet suburb outside Portland, Oregon. The kind of neighborhood where routines rarely change, where people notice when something is even slightly out of place. David was a software engineer, methodical, detail-oriented. Claire told me he trusted records more than memory. If something wasn't written down, he didn't consider it reliable. 3 years ago, David installed a security camera above their front door. Nothing unusual about that. Most houses on the street had one. What was unusual was what he did next. Every morning, David reviewed the previous night's footage, not casually, not in the background. He sat at his desk, opened the files, and watched frame by frame. Time, weather, motion detection, passing cars, animals crossing the frame. Most entries were uneventful. No activity. Car at 11:42 p.m. Wind-triggered sensor that went on for months. Then around the 6-month mark, the entries changed. Claire said David started mentioning gaps, small ones at first, easy to dismiss. A minute missing here. 2 minutes missing there. The timestamps would jump forward without explanation. No matching footage, no visual glitch. David assumed it was technical. He reformatted storage, replaced power supplies. The gaps kept happening. Then something changed. The gaps stopped being random. Every night. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the footage skipped ahead 4 minutes. From 3:17 to 3:21. No error message. No corrupted file. Just absence. David documented it obsessively. 1,095 nights. 1,095 identical gaps. No exceptions. Not during storms. Not during outages. Not during power fluctuations. He contacted the manufacturer. They sent a replacement. Same gap. He installed a different brand. Different model. Same 4 missing minutes. Claire said that's when David stopped treating it like a technical issue. He began staying awake every night. Just before 3:15, he went outside, stood in the driveway, and waited. He watched the camera, watched the recording light, watched the time at 3:17. Nothing happened. The light stayed on. The camera kept recording, but when he reviewed the footage the next morning, the gap was always there. And David was never visible in the first. David Hastings died 8 months ago. Heart attack. He was found in the driveway at 6:30 a.m. by a neighbor leaving for work. The coroner estimated the time of death at approximately 3:20 a.m. Right in the middle of the missing window. Claire contacted me 3 weeks after the funeral. She said she had gone through David's notebooks. In the margins of the final logs, she found something he had written again and again. Not timestamps, not measurements, just 2 words. Simona watching. She wanted to know if her husband had been seeing something real, or if stress and exhaustion had finally caught up with him. I told her I couldn't promise answers, but I could tell her what the footage showed. And if you're listening to this right now, thinking, this feels uncomfortably specific, you're not wrong. These are the kinds of patterns I document here, because once you notice them, it's very hard to stop looking. Claire gave me access to the footage the following week. 3 years of recordings stored on external hard drives, labeled by date, backed up twice. David had been thorough. I started at the beginning. The first few months were exactly what you'd expect from a quiet residential street. Cars passing late at night, headlights sweeping across the driveway, motion, activated lights flicking on and off. A raccoon crossing the frame around 2:40 a.m. A neighbor leaving early for work at 5:12. Nothing unusual. That was important because it meant David hadn't started with a problem. The problem had emerged later. I moved forward week by week. The footage remained consistent. Same angle, same A lighting, same E rhythm. Then I reached the first gap, the 12th of October, month 7. The timestamp read 3 hours, 17 minutes, and 43 seconds in. The next frame jumped to 3 hours, 21 minutes, and 18 seconds. No distortion, no flicker, no corrupted image. Just a clean cut from one moment to the next. I watched it several times. There was no visual cue that recording had stopped. No freeze, no stutter. The file simply resumed 4 minutes later. I checked the metadata. No missing data blocks, no overwrite flags, no storage error. The file was intact. It was as if those 4 minutes had been deliberately removed. I continued forward, night after night. The gap appeared every single time. Samey start, samey end. Always 4 minutes. I started jumping around the timeline. Random dates, different seasons, different years. The result never changed. I logged each occurrence. 1,095 nights. 1,095 gaps. Not a single exception. Not during storms. Not during power outages. Not even the night David replaced the camera entirely. The new camera recorded its first gap the very night it was installed. That was the moment I stopped thinking in terms of equipment. I went back to David's notebooks. The early entries were technical, dry, precise, but as time went on, the language shifted. Less about setting, more about certainty. Gap present again. Verified time manually. No visible interruption. Then later, checked twice. Confirmed with secondary clock. Still missing. David wasn't guessing. He was verifying. I looked at the nights he documented standing in the driveway. 23 attempts, each time. His notes said the same thing. He was outside before 3:17. He stayed until after 3:21. He observed the camera directly. And yet, when I checked those recordings, the driveway was empty both before and after the gap. He never appeared. It wasn't that he vanished mid-frame. It was as if the camera skipped over him entirely. That's when I noticed something else. I started comparing the frame immediately before the gap to the frame immediately after. At first, they were identical, pixel for pixel. But as I moved forward through the timeline, small differences began to appear. A shadow falling at a slightly different angle, a trash bin closer to the curb, a plant leaning in a direction that didn't match the wind reports. Tiny things. The kind of things you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for them. I started taking screenshots, overlaying images, measuring differences. At first, it happened once every few weeks, then once every few days. By the final months, almost every gap showed some change. The changes followed a pattern. They started at the edges of the frame, distant streetlights, far-off trees. Then they moved closer, mid-frame, then the foreground, the driveway itself, the area closest to the camera. I went back and watched the footage, chronologically, gap by gap. The progression was unmistakable. Whatever was changing wasn't random. It was incremental. I stopped watching entire nights and focused only on the moments surrounding the gaps. Before, after. Before, after. The contrast grew clearer with time. By the final year, the frames never matched. Something was always different. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to confirm continuity had been disturbed. I cross-referenced the changes with David's notes. The more detail he recorded, the more frequently the differences appeared. I didn't draw conclusions from that. I just documented it. Then I noticed something David had never written down. In the final months, in the frame after the gap, something appeared at the extreme edge of the image. Not clearly, not consistently. At first, it looked like a shadow. Something darker than the surrounding darkness, easy to miss. I checked earlier footage. It wasn't there. I checked again, night by night, month by month. The shape appeared, sporadically, at first. Then more often, always in the same position, always at the very edge of the frame, always after the missing minutes. I marked the dates, mapped them against the timeline. The appearances increased steadily. By the final month of David's life, the shape appeared almost every night. I didn't know what it was, I didn't know if it mattered, but it was consistent, and consistency is never accidental. That's when I decided to see the location for myself. I visited the house 2 days later. It was a Tuesday afternoon, bright, ordinary. The kind of day that makes everything look harmless. Claire met me at the door. She looked exhausted, not panicked, not emotional, just worn down by months of not knowing what mattered and what didn't. She walked me through the house. David's office was exactly as he had left it. Notebooks stacked neatly on the desk. Hard drives labeled by year. Dates written carefully along the spines. Nothing looked frantic. Nothing looked rushed. This wasn't the space of someone spiraling. It was the space of someone documenting. Then she took me outside. The camera was still mounted above the front door. Same position, same angle, same field of view I had been staring at for days. I checked the mounting bracket, solid, bolted directly into the wall. There was no physical way it could have shifted. I stood in the driveway and looked out at the street. It was unremarkable. Mailboxes, sidewalks, trees lining both sides. Nothing about the location explained 3 years of attention. But standing there, something felt different. Not threatening, not alarming, just attentive. As if the space itself was aware of being observed. I walked toward the street. At the very edge of the driveway, the sensation intensified. This was where David had been found. This was also the exact edge of the camera's frame. I stood there longer than I meant to. Waiting. Nothing happened. That night, I decided to run my own test. I didn't use David's equipment. I brought my own camera. Different brand, different storage. Independent internal clock. I mounted it on my car and positioned it to match the house camera's angle as closely as possible. I brought coffee, a notebook, and a second camera mounted on the dashboard, aimed at my watch. I wanted overlapping references. At 3 a.m., the street was empty. At 3:10, everything was still. Both cameras were recording. At 3:15, I wrote my first note. Street empty, no movement, all equipment functional. At 3:17, nothing changed. The red light stayed on. The street remained quiet. I checked my watch, then my phone, then the dashboard clock. All three matched. 3:18, 3:19. I wrote again. No disruption observed. At 3:20, I felt it. That same sensation I'd noticed earlier in the driveway. Not fear. Awareness. As if the street itself was paying attention. I stayed until 3:25. Nothing happened. At sunrise, I drove home. I reviewed the footage immediately. The gap was there. 4 minutes missing. On my camera, on my equipment. I checked the metadata. No errors. No corruption. No interruption flagged. The recording simply resumed after the gap. I went to the frame immediately following the missing time. At first glance, it looked normal. Then I noticed the edge. Something was standing there. Not fully visible. Partially cropped by the frame, facing away. Still, I checked the frame before the gap. Empty. I checked earlier nights. The figure wasn't there. I went back to David's footage, night by night, month by month. The figure appeared gradually, inconsistent at first. Always after the gap. Always in the same position. Exactly where David had been found. I decided to wait before drawing conclusions. I didn't review my footage again that night. I waited a full day. Then I watched it again. Slower this time, frame by frame. The figure hadn't moved, but something else stood up. The alignment. The figure wasn't centered. It wasn't posed. It was positioned exactly where the camera's view ended, as if it existed just beyond what could be recorded. I compared my footage to David's. Different cameras. Different years. Saw me placement. Saw me distance from the lens. Saw me orientation. I documented the alignment. Then I stopped. Claire told me David had stopped sleeping in the final weeks, that he spent his nights reviewing footage. Then standing in the driveway until morning, she said he felt he needed to be there, that something felt wrong when he wasn't. David's final notebooks reflected that shift. Fewer measurements, more impressions. Then, 3 days before his death, one entry stood out. The figure appeared slightly differently, not facing the camera, but no longer perfectly aligned. I checked that footage. The difference was subtle, easy to miss, but it was there. David's last entry was dated the 28th of January. The next morning, he died at 3:20 a.m. I don't know what occupies those missing 4 minutes. I don't know why the recordings resume the way they do. I only know the pattern remains unchanged. The camera is still recording. The gap still happens. The figure does not move closer, and that's where I stopped. Not because the investigation reached an answer, but because it didn't. Some patterns don't escalate forever. They stabilize. And when they do, the only thing left to change is the observer. David watched for 3 years, documented everything. In the end, the only thing that changed was where he stood.